The houseboat had always been a quiet refuge, resting at the edge of the marina like a deliberate refusal to conform. While the shoreline beyond it filled with manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and rigid neighborhood rules, enforced by laminated notices and passive-aggressive smiles, the water remained lawless in the best way. The tides did not care about committees, the wind did not obey bylaws, and the man who lived aboard the houseboat had chosen it precisely because of that freedom. For years, the marina had existed in a strange overlap with the nearby gated community. The houses on land fell under the control of an aggressive homeowners association that treated authority like a costume it could put on whenever convenient. The marina itself was older than the HOA, loosely regulated and governed mostly by state waterway rules and long-standing permits. That legal grey area had always bothered the HOA board. They disliked anything they could not fully control, and the houseboat sat right at the boundary of their reach, visible from their walking paths, defiant in its independence. The man on the houseboat was well aware of this tension. He had seen the slow escalation over time. First came the anonymous complaints about noise, even on nights when the marina was silent. Then came warnings about visual blight, as if a floating home offended the carefully curated image of suburban order. Flyers appeared on marina bulletin boards citing vague violations, always unsigned, always referencing rules that did not quite apply. The pressure was subtle at first, the kind designed to make someone uncomfortable enough to leave on their own. But he did not leave. He had rebuilt the houseboat himself, reinforcing its structure, modernizing its systems, and keeping meticulous records of every inspection and permit. The vessel was compliant with maritime regulations, environmental standards, and safety codes. Everything about it was lawful, intentional, and documented. The man living there understood systems, rules, and enforcement better than most people ever would. He had spent his adult life inside them, learning where authority began and where it ended. That was why the next escalation felt different the moment it began. It started on a morning that looked ordinary enough. The marina was calm, the water barely rippling under a pale sky. The houseboat rocked gently, the kind of movement that became invisible after living with it long enough. The man noticed the vehicles before he noticed the people. Unmarked SUVs rolled into the gravel lot near the docks, their presence immediately out of place. They parked with a sense of purpose, angled sharply, as if forming a perimeter rather than looking for convenience. Several individuals stepped out, wearing dark uniforms that mimicked law enforcement without fully committing to it. The patches were unfamiliar, the colors slightly off, the badges too shiny and new. The overall effect was theatrical, as though someone had studied authority from a distance and tried to recreate it without understanding the details. They carried clipboards, folders, and radios clipped high on their shoulders, positioned where they would be most visible. The marina residents began to notice. People paused mid-task, watching from decks and docks. A sense of unease spread quickly because nothing disrupts a quiet community faster than the appearance of enforcement without explanation. The group moved with confidence, stepping onto the docks as if they owned them, their boots heavy against the planks. Their attention locked onto the houseboat almost immediately. The man observed all of this from inside, his awareness sharpening rather than spiking. He did not feel fear, he felt recognition. He had seen this behavior before, not in marinas, but in situations where authority was being imitated rather than exercised. There was a rhythm to it, a reliance on intimidation over clarity. Real enforcement did not need to announce itself so loudly. The group approached the houseboat as if executing a rehearsed plan. They photographed the exterior, pointed at structural elements, and gestured toward the shoreline homes as though drawing imaginary jurisdictional lines. Papers were removed from folders and held up for visibility, though not yet presented. Everything was performative, meant to be seen by witnesses as much as by the target. When they finally boarded the dock beside the houseboat, The atmosphere shifted. The marina felt smaller, the space suddenly crowded with tension. The water lapped quietly against the hull, indifferent to the escalation unfolding above it. The man stepped out onto the deck, calm, observant, and silent. He took in the details that others would miss: the mismatched fonts on the paperwork, the incorrect placement of insignia, the subtle way their eyes avoided meeting his directly. They announced their purpose through posture rather than words, standing in a loose formation that suggested authority without discipline. The implication was clear, even without dialogue. They were there to seize control, to declare violations, to initiate removal. The houseboat in their narrative was no longer a home, but a problem to be eliminated. The marina residents watched closely now. Some recorded from a distance. Others whispered among themselves, uncertain whether to intervene or stay clear. The presence of uniforms had its intended effect, creating hesitation and confusion. People assumed legitimacy because they were conditioned to do so. That assumption was the tool being exploited. The man did not argue. He did not raise his voice or react emotionally. He allowed the moment to stretch, understanding that impatience often revealed the truth faster than confrontation. As the group continued their display, he noticed small cracks forming in their confidence. Their movements became slightly rushed. Their gestures grew sharper, more exaggerated. This was not going as smoothly as they had expected. What they did not realize was that every second they spent on that dock was deepening their mistake. The man's life had been shaped by rules and consequences. He had spent years enforcing laws that carried real weight, laws that affected lives and demanded accountability. He understood the difference between authority granted and authority assumed. Standing on the deck of his houseboat, he felt the quiet certainty that comes from knowing exactly where one stands within the law. He had not revealed anything yet. He had not needed to. The situation, however, was no longer contained. The presence of fake authority had disrupted the marina's fragile balance, and word began spreading beyond the docks. Nearby residents leaned over balconies, phones were raised. The HOA's attempt at control was becoming a public spectacle. The group appeared to sense this shift. Their initial confidence gave way to irritation. They wanted compliance, not scrutiny. They wanted fear, not observation. The longer the man remained calm, the more their performance unraveled. And beneath the surface of that calm, a decision was forming. The man knew this encounter would not end quietly. It would either reinforce the HOA's illusion of power or expose it completely. The houseboat was no longer just his home in that moment. It had become a line drawn in water and law, separating those who enforced rules from those who merely pretended to. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp reflections across the marina, the stage was set for the truth to surface. The fake enforcers had come expecting submission. Instead, they had walked directly into a reckoning they did not yet understand. The tension did not explode all at once. It thickened slowly, like fog rolling across the water, until every movement felt deliberate and every breath seemed louder than it should have been. The fake enforcers remained on the dock, shuffling papers, pointing at sections of the houseboat, and gesturing toward the shoreline as if invoking invisible rules. Their authority depended entirely on momentum. As long as they kept moving forward, they assumed no one would stop them. But momentum has a weakness. It requires belief. The man on the houseboat understood that better than they did. He watched how they avoided specifics, how their documentation was never fully displayed, how their attention kept drifting to the gathering crowd. The marina had transformed into an audience, and the performance was beginning to crack under the weight of observation. Authority, real authority, grows stronger when watched. False authority withers. The group began marking things down with exaggerated seriousness. Measurements were taken without tools. Photos were snapped from angles that distorted perspective. They behaved like people trying to manufacture evidence rather than assess reality. The man noted how their focus stayed on appearances instead of substance. They cared how it looked, not how it functioned. That distinction mattered. As the minutes passed, the implication of demolition became clearer. The houseboat was being framed as unsafe, illegal, and non-compliant, despite years of inspections that proved otherwise. The narrative was being written in real time, designed to justify drastic action. This was not enforcement, it was coercion. Around them, Marina residents shifted uneasily. Some had lived there for decades, long before the HOA expanded its reach. Others were newer, unfamiliar with the legal nuances of marina property versus private neighborhoods. What united them was uncertainty. They did not know who had real power in this situation, and uncertainty is where bullies thrive. The man remained still, leaning slightly against the railing of his deck. He allowed the enforcers to continue, understanding that interruption would only reset their control. He wanted them comfortable. He wanted them confident enough to overreach. Every false step they took would matter later. The fake uniforms told a story of borrowed authority. The badges lacked serial markings. The vehicles bore no official insignia. Even their radios were silent props, never crackling with incoming communication. It was a closed system, isolated from any real chain of command. That isolation was dangerous for them, though they did not yet realize it. Their presence began to ripple outward. Marina management was notified. Dock workers slowed their routines. A sense of impending confrontation settled over the water. The houseboat, once just another floating residence, had become the focal point of a territorial dispute that had been brewing quietly for years. The HOA had grown increasingly frustrated with its inability to control the marina. Its power stopped at the waterline, and that boundary offended the board's sense of dominance. The houseboat symbolized that limitation. Removing it would send a message, not just to the man living there, but to everyone watching. It would redefine the boundary through fear rather than law. That was the miscalculation. The man knew exactly which laws governed the marina. He had reviewed them repeatedly, not out of paranoia, but out of habit. His career had trained him to anticipate misuse of power, to recognize when enforcement strayed from legitimacy. He had seen how easily people accepted authority when it was presented with confidence and uniformity. He had also seen how quickly that acceptance vanished when facts were introduced. The fake enforcers began to escalate their physical presence. They positioned themselves closer to the houseboat, crowding the dock, subtly limiting movement. It was a common tactic, one meant to assert dominance without direct confrontation. The marina residents felt it too, the way the space seemed to shrink around the group. What the enforcers did not consider was how their behavior appeared through the lens of real enforcement experience. To the man, their actions were a checklist of red flags: no identification verification, no jurisdictional clarification, no coordination with maritime authorities, no procedural transparency. Each omission was another crack in their facade. The man reached inside the houseboat briefly, not hurried, not defensive. He returned to the deck with the same calm demeanor. This small movement triggered a visible reaction among the enforcers. Their posture tightened. Their attention sharpened. They were suddenly aware that the script they were following might not account for deviation. The crowd noticed too. The atmosphere shifted again, subtle but unmistakable. Something was about to happen. Though no one yet knew what form it would take, the marina felt suspended in time, caught between assertion and exposure. The fake enforcers attempted to reassert control through presence alone. They stood taller, spread wider, and leaned into their roles. But the longer they stayed, the more their authority felt hollow. No official notices were posted. No lawful orders were executed. Everything remained implied, unspoken, and vague. That vagueness was their undoing. The man understood that confrontation did not always require force. Sometimes it required patience. Sometimes it required letting those who abused power reveal themselves fully. He was not just defending his home. He was documenting a pattern, one that would matter far beyond the marina. The houseboat creaked softly as the water shifted beneath it, a reminder that this structure moved with natural forces rather than artificial boundaries. It had survived storms, tides, and years of wear. It would survive this, too. The man felt a deep sense of grounding in that realization. As the situation dragged on, cracks widened. One enforcer checked his watch repeatedly. Another scanned the crowd with visible unease. Their confidence was draining, replaced by irritation and impatience. They wanted resolution, not scrutiny. They wanted compliance, not questions. But the Marina was watching, and watching changes everything. The man prepared for the next phase, knowing that the moment of revelation would come soon. He had allowed the illusion of authority to run its course. He had given them space to commit fully to their role. Now the weight of truth hovered just beneath the surface, ready to rise. This was no longer just about a houseboat or an HOA. It was about the boundary between real power and pretend power, between law and intimidation. The water reflected the sky above, calm and unbothered, even as human tension built along its edge. The shift began quietly, almost imperceptibly, the way real turning points often do. There was no sudden outburst or dramatic movement. Instead, there was a subtle change in posture, in pacing, in the way the fake enforcers began glancing at one another rather than focusing solely on the houseboat. The confidence that had carried them onto the dock was thinning, stretched too far by time and attention. The Marina had become a mirror. Every exaggerated gesture, every hollow display of authority was now reflected back through dozens of watchful eyes. Phones remained raised, conversations hushed. The audience had grown, and with it, the pressure to perform convincingly. False authority depends on isolation. Under observation, it fractures. The man sensed the precise moment when patience turned into leverage. He did not rush it. He remained steady, grounded, letting the imbalance work in his favor. His silence was no longer passive. It was strategic. Each second without escalation made the enforcers look less legitimate, less urgent, less necessary. The group attempted to reclaim momentum by reorganizing themselves. One stood slightly forward, another shifted to block a line of sight, and a third repositioned near the edge of the dock. These movements were meant to appear coordinated, but instead they revealed uncertainty. Real teams move with shared purpose. Imitations move reactively. The paperwork came out again, now waved more assertively, as though proximity alone could substitute for validity. Still, nothing was formally presented, no citations were issued, no official processes were initiated. The act remained incomplete, suspended between threat and execution. The man's awareness narrowed, focusing not on the individuals but on the pattern they represented. This was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of an HOA that had learned it could push boundaries without consequence. The fake enforcers were merely the latest tool, emboldened by a system that rewarded intimidation over legality. He thought about the earlier complaints, the unsigned notices, the creeping sense of surveillance. It all fit together now. The HOA had been testing the limits for years, probing where resistance would form. They had mistaken compliance for consent, silence for surrender. The man took a measured breath and prepared to act. He reached into his jacket with deliberate calm, not hurried, not theatrical. The movement drew immediate attention. The enforcers stiffened, their eyes tracking his hand. The crowd leaned in, sensing that something irreversible was about to happen. What emerged was not a weapon or a document meant to intimidate. It was a badge, worn but unmistakably real. Its design carried weight, not because of its shine, but because of what it represented. It was not decorative, it was earned. The effect was immediate and profound. The posture of the enforcers changed in unison, though not intentionally. Shoulders tensed, feet shifted. The practiced confidence evaporated, replaced by something closer to alarm. They recognized the badge instantly, even if they had hoped never to see one like it. Real authority has a gravity that cannot be replicated. The Marina fell silent. The man did not raise the badge high or thrust it forward. He held it at a natural height, visible but understated. There was no need to exaggerate. Its presence alone altered the power dynamic completely. The dock no longer belonged to the enforcers. It belonged to the law. The illusion collapsed quickly after that. The enforcers' movements became hesitant, their formation loosening. One took a half-step back, then another. Their eyes darted between the badge and each other, searching for reassurance that no longer existed. The script they had relied on had no lines for this moment. The crowd reacted in waves. Confusion gave way to realization. Whispers spread. Phones tilted, capturing the shift. The audience had just learned that the man they were watching was not a passive target, but an active participant in the very system being imitated on the dock. The badge did more than assert authority. It exposed the fraud. The man's calm demeanor took on new meaning. It was no longer puzzling or defiant. It was professional. He had not been intimidated because he understood exactly what was happening. He had not resisted because he was waiting for the truth to surface on its own terms. The fake enforcers attempted to regain composure, but the damage was irreversible. Their confidence had been based on assumption. That assumption had just been dismantled. Without it, they were simply individuals in borrowed uniforms, standing on a dock they had no right to control. The marina felt different now. The air was lighter, the tension redistributed. The houseboat seemed more solid, more anchored than before. The water continued its gentle movement, indifferent to the human drama, but the people watching understood they were witnessing a boundary being enforced correctly for the first time in years. The man did not press forward aggressively. He did not need to. The power shift was complete. His presence alone now demanded accountability. The fake enforcers were no longer directing the situation. They were trapped within it. In that moment, the houseboat stopped being a symbol of defiance and became a symbol of clarity. The line between law and intimidation had been redrawn, not with force, but with legitimacy. The collapse of the illusion did not end the conflict. It transformed it. What had begun as a quiet intimidation attempt now entered a phase of damage control, where every action taken by the fake enforcers only deepened their exposure. The dock felt suddenly smaller, not because of physical proximity, but because there was nowhere left to hide. The enforcers tried to regain structure, but structure without legitimacy is just choreography. Their movements became cautious, restrained by the sudden awareness that they were no longer in control of the narrative. The badge had not raised its voice, but it had silenced theirs. The weight of real authority settled over the marina, and with it came the inevitability of consequences. The man remained composed, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. He understood that panic often forces mistakes, and mistakes create records. The enforcers had come prepared to intimidate, not to explain. Now they were being observed not as officials, but as suspects. The crowd's attention sharpened. People who had once been unsure now watched with clarity. The difference between real enforcement and performance had become visible in posture, tone, and restraint. The man did not posture or threaten. He simply existed within the role he had earned, and that authenticity was undeniable. The fake enforcers began to retreat in small ways. One stepped aside, creating distance from the houseboat. Another lowered their clipboard, no longer pretending to take notes. The radios clipped to their shoulders remained silent, a detail that now screamed louder than any words. Real operations are never isolated. There is always a network, a chain, a response system. Here, there was nothing. The marina residents felt the shift collectively. Fear gave way to validation. Many had experienced similar pressure from the HOA in quieter ways. Warnings, fines, subtle harassment, but had never felt equipped to challenge it. Watching the enforcers unravel confirmed something they had long suspected. The authority used against them was often exaggerated, sometimes entirely fabricated. The man took a slow step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational. The movement alone caused another ripple of reaction. The enforcers adjusted instinctively, revealing how deeply their confidence had relied on intimidation rather than legitimacy. Authority that must be defended with fear is already lost. The situation had reached a point where withdrawal was the only option left to them. But even retreat required coordination they no longer possessed. Their original objective, to seize control of the houseboat, was now impossible. Any further action would only compound their exposure. Behind the scenes, the consequences were already beginning. The presence of cameras meant documentation. The badge meant jurisdiction. The Marina meant witnesses. What had been planned as a quiet enforcement action was now evidence of impersonation, harassment, and potential criminal liability. The houseboat stood unchanged, its structure untouched, its legality unchallenged by any real authority. It had endured the test not by resisting, but by being lawful. The man felt a quiet satisfaction in that. The system had worked not because it was loud, but because it was correct. The fake enforcers attempted to salvage dignity by maintaining formality, but the attempt rang hollow. Without the illusion of power, their uniforms looked like costumes, their badges looked like props. Their presence felt intrusive rather than commanding. The Marina returned to itself gradually. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. Phones remained raised, but now they captured aftermath rather than anticipation. The water continued its rhythm, unconcerned with the human desire for dominance. The man understood that this moment was not an end, it was a pivot. The exposure on the dock would ripple outward, forcing the HOA to confront its overreach publicly. The board had gambled on intimidation and lost. What followed would not be decided on a dock, but through scrutiny, investigation, and accountability. As the enforcers prepared to leave, their earlier confidence had evaporated entirely. They moved without ceremony, without purpose, and without the cohesion they had arrived with. The Marina watched them go, not with triumph, but with relief. The houseboat remained where it belonged. The aftermath did not arrive with sirens or shouting. It arrived with silence, the kind that follows exposure rather than conflict. Once the fake enforcers left the Marina, the water seemed calmer, the air lighter, as if the place itself had exhaled. What remained was not chaos, but clarity, the kind that cannot be undone. The Marina slowly returned to motion. People stepped back onto their decks. Dock lines were checked. Engines hummed faintly in the distance. But something fundamental had changed. The fear that had lingered for years, quiet, unspoken, normalized, had been broken in a single morning, not through aggression, but through legitimacy. The man stood on his houseboat, looking out over the water, aware that the real consequences were only beginning. Exposure does not end a system of abuse instantly. It forces it into the open, where it can no longer hide behind confidence and costume. The HOA's attempt to dominate the Marina had failed publicly, and public failure carries weight. Word traveled fast. Videos circulated, descriptions spread. The phrase fake HOA officers followed by real cop became shorthand for something larger than the incident itself. It wasn't just about a houseboat anymore. It was about how easily authority could be fabricated and how quickly it collapsed when challenged by the truth. The HOA board could not contain the damage. Their previous tactics relied on privacy, on intimidation behind closed doors, on residents who felt isolated and unsure. Now the narrative was visible. Questions arose. Residents demanded clarification. Jurisdiction was scrutinized. Paper trails were requested. The board responded with statements instead of action, distancing itself from the enforcers, claiming misunderstandings, procedural errors, and third-party involvement. But distancing does not erase responsibility. The connection was evident, the pattern undeniable. Authorities beyond the HOA began paying attention. Impersonation carries legal consequences. Harassment carries liability. False enforcement carries risk. The Marina incident was no longer a neighborhood dispute. It was a documented case. The man cooperated fully, not out of obligation, but out of principle. He provided timelines, records, and context. His approach remained calm, professional, and precise. He did not need to exaggerate. The facts were sufficient. For the Marina residents, the change was immediate. Notices stopped appearing. Complaints vanished. The invisible pressure that had followed them for years dissolved almost overnight. Power had been challenged, and in doing so, it had retreated. The houseboat remained anchored, unchanged in structure, but transformed in meaning. It was no longer just a home. It had become proof that systems only function when challenged correctly. That authority must be real to be respected. That fear loses its grip when legitimacy enters the room. The man reflected on the irony of it all. He had chosen the houseboat to escape rigid systems, not to confront them. Yet the confrontation had come anyway, drawn by the same desire for control that governed land and water alike. What mattered was not that it happened, but how it ended. There was no dramatic victory, no public declaration. The ending was quieter, stronger. The Marina continued. The HOA retreated. The line between real law and manufactured authority was reinforced. In the end, the fake enforcers had not just failed to seize a houseboat. They had exposed a truth many had suspected but never proven. Authority without law is just theater, and theater collapses the moment the lights turn on. The water carried on, indifferent and free, and the houseboat rocked gently in place, exactly where it belonged. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.